Join us on Gripping Horror as we delve into the infamous diving spot called the Pool of Death, renowned for claiming the lives of 21 divers. The frigid water temperature and the extreme depth pose significant challenges for divers, leading to a substantial number of drowning incidents and even cases of heart attacks. The number of fatalities at the quarry could have been much higher, considering the numerous close calls and fortunate escapes that have occurred. Dorothy Quarry itself is not fundamentally dangerous. The problem arises from the lack of regulation, which leads divers to attempt things beyond their capabilities. Over the years, numerous harrowing accounts have surfaced of divers pushing their limits to the point of exhaustion. Subsequently, these divers have become incapable of recovering and ascending to the surface. Furthermore, the fact that some individuals are diving as deep as 100 meters on air, despite the accepted limit being 50 meters, says a lot about the lack of awareness and responsibility among some of these divers. These are the harrowing accounts of Paula Blakemore, Jason Dean, and John Edward, and the tragedies that befell them at Dorothy Quarry. Dorothy Quarry has a rich history, dating back to the early 1820s, when it was first leased by William Turner and named Clodford Turner. Later, the quarry was renamed Dorothy by Turner's son in 1829, who was the manager at the time. The quarry was the largest in the area and employed up to 200 men, producing 5,000 to 6,000 tons of slate annually. However, profits began to decline in the 1840s, leading to the quarry's sale in 1848. A group of quarrymen purchased Dorothy and renewed the lease in 1851. Production peaked in 1872, with 17,442 tons produced, and the most profitable year was 1875, generating £14,738, or equivalent to £1.5 million today. By the 1930s, over 350 men were employed at the quarry. However, production dropped after the start of World War II, and the quarry eventually closed in 1970. As stated previously, despite the official ban on diving in the Dorothy Quarry and the lack of provided facilities, the site has become a popular destination for diving since quarrying ended in 1970. However, the unregulated nature of the site and its depth have led some divers to overestimate their abilities. As a result, in the decade between 1994 and 2004, 21 divers lost their lives in the quarry. Located in the Nantal Valley region of North Wales, the Dorothy Quarry is an abandoned slate quarry that spans a vast area near the village of Taliesin and contains 3 flooded deep lakes. With a maximum depth of 106 meters, or 348 feet, the Dorothy Quarry is not only expansive, but also extremely deep. Not to mention there are several deep sections within it, including sections with floors at 25 meters, or 82 feet, 40 meters, or 131 feet, and even deeper. The quarry boasts many remnants of its past, such as old huts, cranes, cables, and tunnel sections. In addition, there is a car stack located on the west side of the quarry, not shown on the maps, where numerous cars have been discarded and piled on top of one another over time. The deeper you venture into the quarry, the older the cars become. Some of the tunnels in the quarry are accessible and lead through outcrops and ridges. The shallowest section near the car park is useful as a deco loop to swim around in while finishing a dive. During the summer months, the water in Dorothy Quarry is affected by severe algae blooms near the surface. However, the water clears up beyond approximately 15 meters or 49 feet. Due to this phenomenon, Dorothy remains dark throughout the year, and other than on the surface, the water in the quarry is excruciatingly cold, especially in the winter. Paula Blakemore had always been passionate about diving. She loved the feeling of weightlessness, the quietness of the underwater world, and the freedom that came with exploring it. So, when her friend Jeff Keep suggested they start a diving club together in 2001, she jumped at the opportunity. The two of them founded New Frontier Diving Limited, which was based at Paula's home on Longdown Road in Concleton, England. They offered diving courses and training to students from all over Greater Manchester, and Paula was the lead instructor. She loved teaching others how to dive and sharing her passion with them. One of her many students stated, she conducted and instructed the course in a professional yet friendly manner. Paula made the course interesting, fun, and as always, drilled in the safety aspects. Another former pupil added, I was immediately impressed by her genuine warmth and enthusiasm for diving, whether it be teaching courses or doing some serious diving for fun. I expected to find the skills tough, but Paula was very flexible in her approach, and we all managed to master the skills required. Paula loved teaching, but her true passion was deep wreck diving, which only grew after completing her rebreather course. Paula Blakemore, now age 43, had always been an adventurer at heart. She loved the feeling of exploring new places, whether on land or underwater. Her love for adventure only grew after meeting her husband, Mike Blakemore, who was also a diver, was a perfect match for Paula. They had been married for 19 years, and their love for adventure only brought them closer together. Paula especially loved the thrill of exploring sunken ships and discovering the secrets they held. Every weekend of the year, Paula would dive with her husband, her close friend Jeff Keep, or other team members. They spent hours underwater, searching for new wrecks to explore and studying the marine life that surrounded them. One day, Paula heard about a quarry in Wales called Dorothy that was rumoured to hold the wreckage of old huts and quarry workings remaining such as cranes, cables and tunnel sections, and she knew she had to explore it. This quarry had pulled divers in with its mystery for decades, and Paula was no exception. Unfortunately for Paula, her excitement was short-lived. As seen, Dorothy Quarry was very unforgiving to divers, and Paula was about to discover this for herself. Paula and her dive buddy Graham Owen arrived at Dorothy Quarry on March the 15th, 2007, eager to explore its depths. Paula was not only satisfying her own desire for adventure, but also practicing for an upcoming charity dive for guide dogs for the blind. Meanwhile, her husband Mike was completing a dive in the same quarry that day as she arrived. The water was cold and dark, but she was determined as she loved nothing more than diving. As Paula and Graham descended into the water, they were filled with excitement and anticipation. They had heard about the quarry's reputation for being a challenging and dangerous dive site, but they were confident in their abilities and eager to explore. The quarry's murky waters made it difficult to see, and the jagged rocks and submerged debris made navigation treacherous. What happens next can be described as a series of unfortunate events. As Graham and Paula descended following a line from a marker buoy, both of them were a bit nasally, and after about 6 meters, or 20 feet, Graham signaled to abort the dive due to difficulty clearing his ears. It was then they noticed that there was a problem with Paula's rebreather. A valve diaphragm had ruptured. Paula had just been above Graham, but then she vanished, and Graham saw the marker buoy sinking past him at a rapid rate. Graham quickly realized that Paula was in trouble and started following the trail of bubbles she left behind as she descended deeper and deeper. He eventually found her clinging to a ridge as she reached 40 meters, or 131 feet below the surface. Paula clinged for dear life in a desperate attempt to stop her descent. Graham saw the rope of the marker buoy tangled around her left leg that was the result of her rapid descent. Graham tried to pull the rope off her foot, but it was stuck, and he could not move it. Paula was breathing using Graham's equipment as her 40 valve stopped her rebreather from functioning, but she was getting tired as she continued to fight to get free. The situation only grew more dire. Graham began to become tangled in the rope himself as he tried to save her. Thankfully, Graham was able to free his legs, but as a result of his vicious movements, Graham was disorientated for a time after, When he came back to his senses, he realized Paula had disappeared again, and Graham couldn't find any bubbles. Despite his best efforts, Graham had to surface without Paula. He was devastated, knowing that she was still down there. Now back on the surface, Graham sounded the alarm and began contacting emergency services. As the search began, Graham was airlifted to hospital in Bangor as he needed treatment due to the speed he had resurfaced after trying to save her, which resulted in the bends. Paula's husband, Mike, was finishing a dive and had clambered out of the water when the alarm was raised. He helplessly stood by with their 3 daughters, having taken the heartbreaking decision to tell other divers on site not to risk their lives by trying to rescue his wife, because he knew she had sunk too deep. After losing contact, Paula would have lasted only a few seconds. The North Wales police were notified, and they launched a search for Paula. Police divers were called in to search the quarry, hoping to find any clues that could lead them to her. Days passed, and the search continued. The divers endlessly searched the quarry from end to end, but they were unable to find any sign of Paula. To make matters worse, efforts to recover her body were hampered by the depth of the water in the quarry and debris below the surface, but they refused to give up. Finally, after days of searching, the police divers decided to bring in an underwater robot to help them search the quarry more thoroughly. The robot was state-of-the-art, equipped with the latest sensors and cameras. It was able to search Dorothy in places that the divers couldn't reach, and it gave them a new hope in their search for Paula. Thankfully, 3 days after the search began, the rescue team discovered a tunnel located 300 feet beneath the surface and found Paula trapped inside. The tunnel was narrow and dangerous, with sharp rocks and poor visibility making it treacherous for even the most experienced divers. It was a grueling and exhausting journey, but finally they emerged from the water, and her body was gently laid in a body bag on site. Those who knew Paula would always remember her as a brave and passionate diver who had lived life to the fullest, even in the face of danger. Her husband went on to say, "I'm numb. She was such a good diver, and I just can't believe this has happened to her." It's a tragic reality that Dorothy's waters have claimed many lives over the years, and Paula's tragic fate serves as yet another grim reminder of the dangers of being trapped beneath its water's surface. Gates have been locked and boulders and machinery placed in the way, but despite this, many divers still feel compelled to test their limits and explore the depths of this mysterious and deadly place. The search for answers and the allure of the unknown continue to draw people in, even as the risks remain ever present. As the diving community continues to grapple with the dangers of Dorothy, we can only hope that measures will be taken to ensure the safety of those who choose to explore its depths. But for now, the war between divers and Dorothy rages on, and the outcome remains uncertain. Jason Dean, aged 31, was a civil engineer in Liverpool, England, who had always been passionate about his work. He loved the challenge of designing and building structures that would stand the test of time, and he was dedicated to ensuring that every project he worked on was a success. Everyone who knew Jason admired him for his clear-headedness, his ability to take on any challenge, and his infectious energy. He was always the life of the party, and he had a way of making everyone feel at ease in his presence. Despite his love for his job, Jason was also a free spirit who loved to explore the world around him. He had always been one to push himself to new heights, both professionally and personally. Jason's taste for adventure started in the Scouts and became a passion that took him around the world. He learned to dive in Malawi, West Africa, and was a keen mountain climber. And in 1998, he decided to take on one of his biggest challenges yet, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro to raise money for the Roy Castle lung cancer appeal. It was no small feat, but Jason was determined to see it through. He spent months preparing for the climb, training his body and mind to withstand the grueling conditions he would face on the mountain. After days of climbing and struggling, he reached the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. It was a moment of triumph, not just for Jason, but for everyone who had supported him and the Roy Castle lung cancer appeal. And it was just one of many adventures that Jason would take on over the years. In 2002, he climbed the Palador Peak in the Himalayas, another feat that tested his strength and determination. But no matter where his adventures took him, Jason remained a free spirit, always pushing himself to new heights and inspiring others to do the same. Next off his bucket list was diving the Dorothy Quarry, but not even Jason could have been prepared for the challenges he would face. Despite his experience as an adventurer, diving in the Dorothy Quarry proved to be one of the most difficult and dangerous undertakings of his life. Jason arrived at Dorothy Quarry on the 21st of March 2004. Jason was one of a group of 5 divers from Wirral who planned to dive about 30 to 35 meters, or about 115 feet. The group had originally intended to dive off the Welsh coast of Anglesey, but were forced to cancel because of the bad weather. Once at the quarry, they split into 2 groups, Jason going diving with a close friend, Matthew McNeil, while 3 others went diving in another part of the quarry. They all intended to dive no more than 30 minutes to minimize the possibility of any risks. As they descended into the murky waters of the Dorothy Quarry, Jason and Matthew kept in close communication, checking on each other's gear and making sure they were safe. But as they reached a halfway depth of their intended dive, something went wrong with his equipment. Matthew and Jason had been swimming towards an area of the quarry at a depth of around 50 feet, when Jason signaled that he wanted to surface. Matthew was immediately concerned, knowing that something must either be wrong with Jason or his equipment. Wanting to ensure the life of his friend, the pair decided to turn back. During their ascent, Matthew realized they were ascending too quickly, signaling to Jason to slow down. At this point, Jason did not appear to be panicking, but in the murky waters of the quarry, it was difficult to communicate effectively, and it's unclear whether Jason had understood the signal. They managed and were now approaching their stop. During the decompression stop, Jason had difficulties maintaining buoyancy. Then, suddenly, in the blink of an eye, similar to Paula's case, Jason began sinking rapidly without warning, and Matthew had no time to react or figure out the cause. Jason was frantically trying to sort things out as he was all over the place. He desperately tried, but failed to fit a spare regulator. Jason was chucking air like a jacuzzi. He was not normally a panicker. Instead of getting better, things got worse. Matthew tried to put air in Jason's dive jacket to help him ascend, but he kept knocking it. Jason was breathing very, very fast. The panic in his eyes was awful. It was out of character. Matthew inflated his own jacket, but it separated both of them quite rapidly. Matthew was trying to get Jason sorted, but couldn't do that because Jason kept panicking. Then Jason let go of him, and he let go of Jason. Matthew descended quickly to try and catch up with Jason, but it was already too late. Jason was sinking faster than he could swim, and at this point there was no way of reaching him without endangering his own life. Matthew was starting to get the bends. Defeated, he returned to the surface to initiate rescue operations. The other members of the diving group had heard his distress signals and frantically rushed back to the surface. Similar to Paula's story, North Wales police divers arrived on the scene promptly and set up their high-tech robots to scour the depths of Dorothy. Thankfully, due to the North Wales Police robot mini-submarine, they were able to locate Jason's body that same day at 4 p.m, floating on a ledge at a depth of about 40 meters, or 131 feet, with his regulator out of his mouth. A police spokesman confirmed his family had been informed, and a post-mortem examination was due to be carried out at Ysbyty Gwynedd that same day. Jason's death had been the 7th death in the quarry over the year, and locals were calling for stricter controls over Dorothy. His death was revealed to be caused by drowning due to equipment failure. The reason why Jason did not remove his weight belt has always been a mystery to other divers. It is widely believed that this simple precaution could have potentially saved his life by stopping his rapid descent. Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that he could have done more, and felt a deep sense of survivor's guilt. But despite his pain, Matthew found solace in the memories of his friend and in the knowledge that Jason had lived his life to the fullest, always seeking out new challenges and adventures. And he resolved to honor Jason's memory by continuing to explore and push his own limits, always with a deep respect for the risks and dangers of the world of adventure. This next story took the sub-aqua community by shock, but as seen many times before, the depths of Dorothy does not discriminate its victims. John Edward Hebbard, aged 53, of Charminster Close, Great Sankey, was a man of adventure. As a father of two, John had a deep sense of responsibility towards his family, always making sure to be as safe as possible, but he never let that stop him from pursuing his passions. John had completed over 1,000 dives in his lifetime and was a former member of the Warrington Sub-Aqua Club. He had explored some of the most beautiful and challenging dive sites around the world, and he had always done so with a sense of joy and wonder. But earlier this year, tragedy struck. John was involved in a motorcycle accident that left him with several broken bones and a long road to recovery. The accident was a wake-up call for John, and as he recovered from his injuries, John started to reflect on his life and his priorities. He started spending more time with his wife and children, but he could never get rid of that severe itch for adventure. He knew that he needed to find a way to balance his passions with his responsibilities, and he started to plan for his next dive. John dove 2 years ago in the southern Red Sea as part of a group of 16. It had been an unforgettable experience for him, and wanting to relive that experience, John had a second expedition planned to the Red Sea in January, and he was determined to be ready for it. Fully aware of the dangers that lurked in the Red Sea, including strong currents and hazardous conditions, John, being a meticulous and cautious diver, recognized the importance of being in top form before exploring its depths. With this in mind, he opted to train at the Dorothy Quarry, honing his skills and preparing himself for the upcoming dive. On December the 20th, 2003, John and his buddy diver arrived at Dorothy Quarry. As it was winter, the waters were exceptionally cold, posing a challenge for even the most experienced divers. Given John's recent motorcycle accident, coping with the frigid temperatures would be an additional hurdle for him to overcome. Nevertheless, they donned their wetsuits and gear and descended into the icy waters, determined to explore the old quarry workings and practice for his upcoming dive. The cold water proved to be an immediate shock to John's body, and he struggled to maintain his buoyancy as they swam deeper into the quarry. Regardless of the warning signs, they continued on and finally reached the car stack located deep in the west side of the quarry. Now satisfied, the pair signaled to each other and began their ascent back to the surface. And as the water was extremely cold, they knew it would be best to exit the quarry immediately, as they had been diving for around 45 minutes at this point. As they began swimming up, John's buddy diver noticed that he was struggling. The freezing water had made his movement sluggish and difficult to read. Unbeknownst to his buddy diver, John had suffered a heart attack due to the extreme cold of the water. He gripped his chest with extreme panic in his eyes. Unfortunately for John, the heart attack occurred in the worst possible place, 40 meters or 131 feet from the surface in the deep, dark and cold depths of Dorothy, causing him to rapidly lose consciousness from the shock. Despite his buddy diver's valiant efforts to bring him to the surface, John's lifeless body proved too heavy to lift alone. In a desperate attempt to save John, his buddy diver watched in horror as John slowly sank back into the depths of Dorothy, disappearing from sight. Left with no other options, his buddy diver quickly swam to the surface to initiate rescue operations. The frigid winter waters hit him with brutal force, but he battled through the pain, driven by the urgent need to save his friend. He called for help just after 1:15 in the afternoon, and within minutes, a team of divers arrived on the scene. The response for their swift response was that the rescue operations were already on standby, due to the high number of recent deaths that had occurred at the quarry in the past year. Due to the prompt response of the rescue divers, they were able to reach John just in time before he sunk to the deep. The North Wales police divers frantically brought John's lifeless body to the surface, still holding on to the small glimmer of hope that he could still be alive. The rescue team promptly put John in the air ambulance and rushed him to Ysbyty Gwynedd Hospital. But, despite their best efforts, John was pronounced dead on arrival. To compound the tragedy, the buddy diver suffered from the bends, a painful and potentially fatal condition caused by his rapid ascent to the surface. He was promptly airlifted to a specialist decompression chamber on the Wirral for urgent treatment, and thankfully, he managed to survive. Once again, as seen many times in cave diving, tragedy can strike at any time for those who dare to venture into the depths of the underwater world. Dorothy Quarry remains as a sober reminder of the risks involved in such endeavours. It highlights that even the most experienced and skilled divers can fall victim to the hazards of the deep, and that safety should always be the top priority when embarking on such adventures. May Paula, Jason, and John rest in peace. Greetings and welcome to Gripping Horror. In the heart of Leicestershire, between Stony Stanton and Broughton Astley, lies Stony Cove. Known as the National Diving Centre of England, this site is used by about 60,000 divers each year. Tragically, at least one diver has drowned each year since the centre opened in 1978. In 2003, the centre was fined £7,500 and ordered to pay more than £40,000 in costs following the death of an amateur diver. Still, its allure continues to pull both experienced and beginner divers into its frigid waters day after day. These are the tragedies of Richard Stansfield and Roger Clark. While England may be known for its rainy weather, ancient Stonehenge, and talented musicians, don't discount this country's love for scuba diving. The United Kingdom is one of the cold water diving capitals of the world. In fact, with 12,429 kilometres or 7,723 miles of coastline and over 40,000 inland bodies of water, the island maintains a profound connection to the sea. One would think that being an island should mean that coastal diving locations are plentiful in the UK, but even still its diving community has turned towards inland diving amid lakes, lochs and quarries. Stony Cove is self-described as the UK's most popular inland diving centre. It is one of three that lie in the village of Stony Stanton. The other two have been infilled. Stony Cove, and ultimately Stony Stanton, is situated in the county of Leicestershire, central England. The quarry first began production at the beginning of the 19th century, when granite was used to repair roads. In 1850, a railway line was built to move granite from the bottom to the top of the pit. When quarrying died out in 1958, spring water, which had been a constant problem during the pit's working years, was allowed to flood the quarry. Diving in the quarry first started around the 1960s. During this time, the quarry was primarily used to train commercial divers, en route for the North Sea oil fields. As scuba diving gained popularity, Stony Cove transitioned into the amazing underwater adventure park it is today. While the site is widely enjoyed by all levels of divers, it is still used to train police divers, US Air Force, and even the Historic Diving Society. Stony Cove has numerous underwater attractions, both original and deliberately placed. The site includes a helicopter, bus, boats, armoured cars, shipwrecks, and even a submarine. There is also plenty of fish life, such as perch, roach, pike, and crayfish. The 12.5-acre quarry consists of three main levels: a 6-metre shelf area, ideal for beginner training, a 36-metre sump for more advanced training, and the main body consisting of two large 22-metre deep areas. The deepest parts of Stony Cove are dark, cold, and a far cry from the comparatively tropical shallows. This area is strictly for advanced and experienced divers. Temperatures are much colder, and as you descend down from the 20-meter cliff, it feels like somebody switched the lights off. The silty bottom is also a hazard, so divers must take care not to disturb the sediment and reduce visibility. The deepest part of the quarry is known as the pit and reaches a maximum depth of 115 feet, or 35 meters. For those who are experienced, there is one point of interest in this area: the deep hydro box. Comprising a 5-meter tall metal structure, the box is designed to provide a dry working environment for underwater tasks, such as welding. Divers exploring the box can swim through the top opening and out through the bottom. Great care must be taken when exploring the box, due to the depth, risk of reduced visibility, and entering an enclosed, overhead space inside the box. Navigating the features in Stony Cove isn't always as simple as may seem, especially if the visibility isn't great. Thus, it's recommended that divers plan a route using multiple waypoints before entering. Nigel Craig, a veteran diver with 20 years of experience, had a deep passion for diving that completely ceased to exist after the 24th of July, 2016. A builder by trade, Nigel had been interested in diving since he was a boy, but it was only when he had his own young family that he embarked on PADI training courses, initially abroad and then in 1996 at Stony Cove, where he practiced his newfound craft. With each dive, he became more entranced with the water, forging a connection that would define his life. As the years passed, Nigel made hundreds of dives at the quarry as a diver. Nigel would attend weekly pool sessions and spend Saturdays at the Dive Northampton shop and Sundays diving. Over time, he had progressed through the training until he qualified as a PADI Master Instructor in 2013. Over the years, he certified 300 students and assisted in the certification of countless others. Among them was a student named Richard Stansfield, who was in the midst of certification process. Richard Stansfield, an electrician from Northampton, was not your typical 40-year-old. With a firm dedication to his work at High Tech Electrical, he had gained a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail and innovative problem-solving skills. Yet, beyond his work, Richard harboured a lesser-known passion for diving. His weekends were often spent exploring the depths of Stony Cove, which, after gaining his advanced open water certification, allowed him to venture into more advanced sections. On Sunday, the 24th of July 2016, Nigel began the PADI Deep Speciality course dive for Richard. It was the second dive of the PADI Deep Speciality course, the first of which Richard had already completed during his advanced open water program. The course helps divers to better understand the effects of pressure at depth and the importance of making safety stops to mitigate the potential for decompression sickness. The maximum allowable depth of the dive is 40 meters and includes a short navigation swim before making a free ascent using gauges or a dive computer to maintain a safe ascent rate. The course standards mandate a 3-minute safety stop at 5 meters before surfacing. The day before the dive, Nigel had been through some checks at the Dive Northampton shop with Richard. Richard was Nigel's only dive student that day and was accompanied by dive master Carol Tokarczyk, with whom he had dived previously and with whom Nigel had worked several times before. After the briefing and safety check, the team swam approximately 100 meters to a descent line, marking the hydro box. The team stopped at the marker buoy to allow an out-of-breath Richard time to recover after the surface swim. It took around 10 minutes more to reach the dive's maximum depth of approximately 105 feet, or 32 meters, as Richard had problems equalizing. Nigel took an air check at the bottom, and Richard indicated he had 150 bar remaining in his 12-litre cylinder, having started the dive with 250. Nigel and Carol were using 12-litre twin sets, plenty for both themselves and as a contingency supply if necessary. Richard struggled with his buoyancy during his first attempt at the navigation exercise, so Nigel cut him short to repeat the skill, which he did successfully. At this point, Nigel performed a second air check and received a signal for 60 bar in response. This was much less than Nigel had expected, based on his earlier check, so he immediately ended the dive and began the ascent, instructing Carroll to continuously monitor Richard's gauge on the way up. At about 59 feet, or 18 meters, Richard indicated he was out of air, despite at least 20 bar remaining in his tank. There was no indication of any heavy breathing and no sign of panic, so Nigel decided to swap him onto Carroll's alternate regulator. Seeking reassurance from Richard, now breathing from Carroll's twin set, the group continued to ascend, but Richard signaled once again that he was out of air. Nigel was confused. He purged the regulator, checked Carroll's regulator, and everything was fine. Once again, the group had another out of air, and so Nigel decided to put him on his own regulator. They did the standard, look at my eyes, calm down signals. Once Nigel got the okays, they carried on up. Approaching safety stop depth, Richard indicated he was okay and appeared calm, and with a more than adequate reserve of air, Craig judged it prudent to continue with the planned safety stop. As stated earlier, it is a requirement of the course and standard practice for recreational diving. 2 minutes into the safety stop, Richard appeared to panic and tried to bolt for the surface, so Nigel reached out to prevent him from making an unsafe ascent, during which the regulator from which he was breathing would have been pulled from his mouth. Nigel held him at the safety stop, made eye contact, checked their computers. They had about a minute or so left. Nigel took a second to think. He didn't understand why Richard was saying he's got no air when he's got air. Then Nigel looked up, and Richard's eyes had gone, appearing with a glazed look to them, with his regulators out of his mouth. Nigel indicated to Carroll that he was going back to the surface. Nigel filled Richard's buoyancy control device and his own and ascended to the top. Carroll took his weights off and ascended as well. On the surface, Nigel shouted for help and started rescue breathing. Richard was taken to the shore by Stony Cove's rescue boat, where he was resuscitated by paramedics and taken by ambulance to hospital. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff, however, Richard was pronounced dead some 5 hours later. Nigel was interviewed by police in the aftermath of the incident and attended a voluntary interview in 2017 to clarify details of his original statement, but he was never treated as a suspect. A British Health and Safety Executive investigation found that neither he nor Dive Northampton had any case to answer. Nigel and his wife, Deela, moved on with their life as best they could until, in September 2020, more than 4 years after the tragic events of July 2016, Craig received a letter informing him that he would be prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter. The prosecution based its entire case on the idea that Craig had held his unwilling student underwater, in the misguided belief that a safety stop was more important than preventing him drowning. Commander Baldwin's report into the incident tried to implicate Nigel's dive plan as the starting point for the fatality. Using the rule of thirds, he said Nigel should have ended the dive as soon as they reached their maximum depth. When Richard signaled, he had 160 bar remaining. Dive computer records submitted as evidence showed that Richard had misreported his air supply by as much as 30 bar during the first air check, which the prosecution told the jury was Craig's fault for not directly observing his student's computer. Crucially, Richard had been diagnosed with high blood pressure, for which he was taking medication and which he had failed to state in his medical declaration prior to taking the course. He was also found to have traces of alcohol and cocaine in his system, although it was not known if these might have had any bearing on the circumstances that led to his death. The crux of the prosecution case, however, was that the safety stop was not necessary, and that Craig should have ascended to the surface with his out-of-air diver. A diver signalling out of air when they still have a working supply is a recognized sign of immersion pulmonary edema, a condition where the lungs spontaneously fill with fluid upon immersion in cold water, which, if untreated, eventually causes the diver to asphyxiate. It is most likely to occur in people with high blood pressure, which Richard had. The prosecution largely ignored that IPO was a possibility, claiming that it was not relevant. IPO was first described by Dr. Peter Wilmhurst, a senior member of the UK Diving Medical Committee, in 1989, but the dive community has been slow to recognise its dangers, so even as late as 2016, very few people knew anything about it. Dive computer printouts submitted as evidence to the court suggested that a small burst of air was released from Richard's tank during the safety stop, which the prosecution's expert witness concluded was air being put into his jacket. In what seemed like an attempt to further denigrate Nigel's competence as an instructor, the prosecution alleged that Craig had deliberately controlled his student's buoyancy to keep him underwater while he drowned. Much of the prosecution's case was debunked by expert technical, military, and cave diving instructor Kevin Gurr, who noted in his report for the defense that the dive team had a more than adequate emergency air supply, and because Richard was breathing and appeared calm during their air-sharing ascent, Nigel may have considered the safety stop appropriate. Once the closing arguments had been made, Nigel and his wife had to wait 2 days while the jury deliberated. With no news coming from the court, the couple discussed their financial future on the assumption he would be jailed. 2 days of deliberation resulted in a hung jury. The prosecution, for reasons known only to themselves, decided not to opt for a retrial, and the judge directed a verdict of not guilty. But for Nigel and Della, the damage had been done. Nigel lost his sole source of income as he could not cope with working through the month-long trial. He, Della, and their 2 children struggled through an emotional roller coaster, not knowing if he would be imprisoned. The local dive community lost an experienced and well-regarded instructor. Nigel is quoted on record saying, "I will never teach again. I would like to dive again, probably not in this country, but when I was out in Menorca last year, I did a bit of snorkeling, and even that messed with my head. I get very emotional very easily now, which was never the case before." Merely 2 years later, Stony Cove would find itself in the spotlight again. Tragically, another student's life would be lost, and an instructor's reputation will be forever tarnished. Lance Palmer, owner of LP Diving and Marine Services, has been in the diving business for over 30 years since leaving the military. Trained as a commercial diver, he has a wide background in many diving arenas, including working in the film industry as a marine supervisor on many films, including blockbusters such as 1917, James Bond, and Mamma Mia. Having established himself as a commercial diver, Lance set up his own business, servicing diving equipment for the recreational diving sector, which quickly grew into the business it is today. A busy service centre catering for divers, air gunners, and paintball enthusiasts. The current site has been in operation for many years and is now a familiar dive centre within the community. In June 2018, Lance was conducting an entry-level technical diving international closed-circuit rebreather course, in which Roger Clark, a 55-year-old experienced recreational diver and father of 2, was taking part in. During the inquest, it was revealed that Lance had serviced Roger's rebreather before the dive, which expert testimony found was carried out with significant failings. After completing their pre-dive checks and gearing up, the pair began their descent into the depths, along with a rescue diver. According to expert testimony, the rescue diver, which was chosen by Lance, was not adequately qualified and should not have been assigned for the dive. The course standards mandate a maximum depth for the dive of 98 feet, or 30 meters. However, Lance took Roger to Stony Cove Sump, an area with a maximum depth of 35 meters and known for its poor visibility. The trio went as deep as 115 feet, or 35 meters, which, in the plankton-rich waters of this quarry, made it very green and dark. While in the sump, Roger's rebreather issued a number of alarms, requiring him to bail out onto his backup cylinder. However, Lance did not notice this, as he failed to remain in close enough proximity to monitor Roger, who was totally reliant on him, which meant he did not notice the audible and visual alarms sounding on Roger's breathing device. As the trio navigated around the sump, Roger suddenly became unconscious, and, following a failed attempt by Lance and the safety diver to return Roger to the surface, all three divers remained at 35 meters for 3 minutes, during which time it was shown that Roger had not been using any breathing apparatus. By the time Lance and his safety diver had brought Roger to the surface, he had drowned. After the post-mortem, they took him down to pathology for 18 weeks before they would give him back to his family for the funeral. Therefore, the funeral didn't take place until October the 26th. Lance admitted breaching Section 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. According to health and safety executive inspectors, this was a tragic and wholly avoidable incident caused by the failure of Lance Palmer to plan, manage and conduct his diving training in accordance with the law and his training agency's rules. In his conclusion, Ivan Cartwright, area courier for Leicester City and South Leicestershire, found that errors and omissions by Lance and safety diver significantly increased the risks associated with the dive and may have caused or contributed to Roger's death. Lance was sentenced at Leicester Magistrates Court on the 25th of January. He was ordered to undertake 50 hours unpaid work and costs of £3,085. In a family impact statement, Roger's widow, Angela, said that her husband's death has left her with a fear of water. She's quoted on record stating, "From the day I lost Roger to this day, I cannot get into water, not even a bath, and I can't even put my face into a shower. He was my world. We had a good lifestyle. We had everything. I lost my world and reason to live, and all I wanted to do was curl up and die, and to be with my husband. I have only one regret in my life, not being with my husband when he died." Stony Cove Quarry remains a place of both adventure and caution, where the echoes of past tragedies serve as a somber reminder of the importance of meticulous preparation and utmost safety when exploring its waters. May Richard and Roger rest in peace.
Where people are dying is these areas over here where it's just a rock face cliff. They're jumping down at heights equivalent to what people are jumping off the Gay Street Bridge to commit suicide, breaking bones. People don't realize when you hit the water that from a height that it's disabling them, and they're drowning.
Greetings and welcome to Gripping Horror. This is Augusta Quarry, one of the most scenic locations in the city of Fort Dickerson, Tennessee. Beneath the placid reflection, the water is deep, really deep. For decades, this quarry has been plagued with swimmers leaping from its deadly 80 to 100 feet high cliffs in search of a thrill. Despite increased efforts by the city to discourage this risky behavior, many people still jump. In 2015, city workers posted signs and temporary fencing along the cliffs at the quarry after 3 men jumped to their death in a 4-week period. The Knox County Rescue Squad is responsible for responding to these incidents and would routinely go down to the quarry and drag for dead bodies at least once a year. In the span of 50 years and countless calls, only one has tragically ended in fatality. This is the story of Quarry Berggren. Born on April 2nd, 1955, Quarry Berggren was a person few and far between. According to those who knew him, he loved to dance, he loved to flirt, he loved to dive, he loved to live. Quarry possessed a heart of gold and dedicated 2 decades of his life to working at the Tennessee School for the Deaf. When he wasn't working, Quarry was an active Special Services member of the Knoxville Volunteer Emergency Rescue Squad's water rescue team and was considered one of the best trained divers in the Southeast. He held a dozen diving instructor certifications, including Trimix, Assistant Cavern, DAN Oxygen, YMCA SLAM and Cavern, and EANX Cave Diver courses. He was also interested in computers and combined computers with diving to produce software which allowed divers to create dive tables by using multiple gas changes. Quarry was also an author of many instructional scuba diving manuals, establishing himself as a credible source in the diving community. The Knoxville Volunteer Emergency Rescue Squad began with 12 men meeting in a garage more than 50 years ago. The story started September 16th, 1956, when 15-year-old Charles Edward Howard dived into the swift-moving waters of the Holston River in Strawberry Plains. He never came up. Knox County had no organized rescue squad, and the search for the boy's body lasted for days until authorities called in members of the Greenville Rescue Squad to help local volunteers. 10 men met in Bill Dixon's garage on Rutledge Pike a month later to talk about forming a rescue squad. Willard Howard, the drowned boy's father, attended the first meeting. Early members of KVERS received basic training in first aid and learned other tactics on duty. Now, the squad boasts an annual budget of $335,000 and teams that specialize in such tactics as cave rescue, water rescue, trench rescue, medical treatment, diving, and support. The squad has earned national recognition for its efforts. Agencies around the country often call for help. The KVERS organization saves the county millions of dollars as they do it all free of charge. Some calls end up bringing new recruits. Kirsty Cook joined after the squad helped recover the body of her 20-month-old son, Will Brown, who drowned when her estranged husband jumped from the South Knoxville Bridge on Christmas Day, 2003, with a boy in his arms. The crews never know what the next call might bring, but they never hesitate to answer a page or walk out the door. Knoxville was once nicknamed Marble City and became nationally famous for pinkish rock quarried in deep pits close to what would become downtown Knoxville. Originally a 1,000-foot high hill topped by a Union Civil War fort, Augusta Quarry was excavated for limestone during the first half of the 20th century. After the Lamberts ran the operation as a family business, Vulcan Materials acquired the quarry and managed its final stages. By the 1970s, the quarry closed and the water pumping ceased. Without the removal of water, the quarry filled and a 300-foot deep lake formed. It became a hotspot to dump undesired things, such as cars and bodies in Knoxville. Divers of the Knoxville Rescue Squad were regularly sent down to read the VIN numbers on the cars that were at the bottom to make sure there weren't any new cars dumped in the quarry. At one point, the city of Knoxville blocked car access by putting boulders in the path of the trail due to the immense amount of dumping. The quarry is currently used by the local residents of Knoxville as a swimming spot. Augusta Quarry has the reputation for hosting a lively crowd. The quarry has been used as a popular drinking spot since the beginning of the 1980s. Thus, the diving deaths are generally drunk people going to the higher cliffs and jumping off from way too high, according to DJ Corcoran, Knoxville Fire Department spokesperson. He said it's like hitting concrete. When people jump from a ledge that high, it's like jumping off the Gay or Henley Street Bridge. When they come up, they have broken ribs, bruises on arms where they hit the water, and it knocks the wind out of them. As stated before, Augusta Quarry is deep, in places up to 300 feet deep or more. With no lifeguard on duty, swimmers are at their own risk. The signs posted all around the cliffs of the quarry read, "There are serious dangers to swimming in a quarry." The city of Knoxville does not authorize, invite, or recommend swimming here, and it is not responsible for any death or injury. Despite the city of Knoxville's clear disapproval of swimming in this area, locals still flock to the site during summer months. Though, very few individuals actually dive the site with scuba gear. There's a full-size crane left over from the quarry's working days. At 211 feet, but close to zero, divers have made the dive down to explore it. On August the 24th, 1995, the Knoxville Volunteer Rescue Squad received a distress call regarding a young man by the name of Aaron, who had spent the day at Augusta Quarry with his 4 roommates. Aaron had encountered difficulties after jumping from the cliffs at the quarry and never resurfaced. Drowning victims often float to the surface of water over time. However, the depths of quarry waters and the debris scattered on the quarry floor often entomb drowning victims. To enter the water in a sane way, divers must approach the quarry from the south side, where an old mining road enters the water at a gentle slope. During the subsequent recovery operation, Quarry opted to dive with nitrox. Nitrox is not typically used for deep diving because it contains a higher percentage of oxygen, which can become harmful or toxic when breathed under high-pressure conditions, such as those encountered at significant depths in the quarry. Divers often use different gas mixtures, like trimix, for deep dives to prevent oxygen toxicity and ensure their safety. Quarry mistakenly used a set of dive tanks filled with 36% nitrox, which proved to be a fatal mistake. The maximum operating depth of nitrox with 36% oxygen is 29 meters or 95 feet to ensure the partial pressure of oxygen does not reach dangerous levels, resulting in oxygen toxicity. As the dive progressed, Quarry and his partner used powerful cave lights to explore the lower depths of the quarry when the light reflected off a shiny object. A closer examination revealed human remains still clad in a pair of bright red shorts, like the ones Aaron had been wearing when he drowned. Approximately 27 minutes into the dive, at a depth of 212 feet, Quarry experienced oxygen convulsions. This dire situation was a result of the nitrox within his tanks becoming dangerously toxic due to the extreme depth he had reached, subsequently triggering a seizure followed by asphyxiation. Losing control of his movements, Quarry shot uncontrollably towards the surface from the unforgiving depth of 212 feet. Subjecting his body to a brutal and rapid change in pressure it could not withstand. Standby divers of the KVERS on the surface managed to recover Quarry's lifeless body, while his dive partner recovered the body of Aaron, which now had multiple water moccasin bites. Following this tragic incident, Quarry was rushed to the University of Tennessee Medical Center and immediately placed within a hyperbaric chamber for decompression. Tragically, his horrific ordeal continued as he suffered a heart attack during this process. And despite the valiant efforts of medical professionals, Quarry succumbed to the heart failure and passed away at the medical center. More than 40 rescue agencies were represented at Quarry's funeral, which was interpreted in sign language for students of the Tennessee School for the Deaf. A rescue squad dive truck carried his body to the cemetery, where a Lifestar emergency helicopter flew overhead in tribute. He was survived by his parents, Polly and Fred Berggren, and brother, Kevin. In 1996, a year after the tragic accident, Quarry was honored by the United States official National EMS Memorial Service. Longtime squad members still fall silent at the mention of Quarry's name. When asked about him today, his teammates speak with a strange mix of detachment, muffled sadness, and restless unease. A shiny, wood-mounted commemorative plaque, inscribed with Quarry's name, stands alone in the center of the squad's front room trophy case, part memory and part reminder. On August the 25th, 2020, the squad gathered at Augusta Quarry for a solemn ceremony, remembering Quarry. A wreath was floated as the squad members reflected on the sacrifices that he made. The volunteer organization that started out as a handful of men in ties, answering calls in a converted bread truck, now encompass 143 members, male and female, who answered more than 2,600 calls per year around East Tennessee. In present day, the Augusta Quarry is transitioning into a public recreation site. The Aslan Foundation is partnering with the city of Knoxville to redesign this site in 3 phases. Phase 1 created a temporary parking area to access the Quarry Lake in the summer of 2017. Phase 2 in 2018 included the construction of a gateway, roadway and parking lot. Phase 3 will include the construction of a boardwalk, kiosk and restrooms. The $5 million upgrades are expected to wrap up by the summer of 2024. The war on cliff jumpers has shown no signs of stopping. Deaths are happening 3 times every year. Those who choose to leap into the quarry waters will be left entirely at the mercy of its depths. This is Dayhouse Quarry, a once popular inland dive site that catered to adrenaline junkies of all types. Prior to its closure, the quarry bore witness to several tragic incidents that served as a reminder of the dangers that come with diving the site. In 2005, an Easter weekend getaway ended in tragedy after Hank Austin drowned, while his girlfriend, Janine Davidson Evans, died after her lungs were torn from a shift in pressure. Unfortunately, as more divers discovered the quarry, more tragedies occurred. Among these stories are those of Mary Redsill, Wojciech Uras, Lance Corporal George Partridge, Camilla Sokolowska, and Richard Sanders. These are the Dayhouse Quarry disasters. Dayhouse Quarry is a brilliantly clear dolomite deep quarry found on the cusp of the Wales-England border. The site is often referred to as Chepstow Quarry because of its neighbouring Chepstow Township, nestled along the Wye River in between the Wye Valley and the Forest of Dean. This spectacular freshwater quarry dates back to 1938, when it was first marked on the map. The rocks in the Dayhouse Quarry formed 340 million years ago, during the early part of the Carboniferous period. In the late 1990s, the quarrying ceased at Dayhouse, and in 2003, the National Diving and Activity Centre, popularly known by its acronym and pronounced NDAC, opened in the former quarry. The NDAC was popular with technical and free divers due to the depths of the quarry, ranging from 6 to 85 metres. PADI and IANTD training was provided on site, and many British Sub-Aqua Club and Sub-Aqua Association clubs used the site for training. The NDAC also provided a range of sunken attractions at depths ranging from 6 to 76 metres to suit all diver levels. One of the very practical things at Dayhouse Quarry was that most of the sunken attractions had tethered lines and numbered buoys. These numbers corresponded to a displayed map of the area found in the dive centre. In the latter stages of the site, the NDAC had diversified its business and added other activities alongside diving, including open water swimming, an inflatable course, bungee jumps, a zip wire, and paddleboarding. The quarry is accessed by long pontoons. The deep area drops off, which is where most tech divers kit up and jump. From there, divers normally descend a 40-metre shot line alongside the wall, which then meets a sloping bottom down to about 85 metres. This line also branches off to a 9-metre and 6-metre decompression trapeze. Divers also had the option to surface swim out a few metres and take a blue water line straight down to the bottom. But that was not the norm. From 35 metres to the bottom, the visibility is usually pretty good. Around 8 metres, the surface temperature fluctuates, but from a depth of 40 metres, it stays pretty static at about 7 degrees Celsius. Now, shifting gears from the quarry, let's delve into the story of Mary Redstill. Mary Redstill, aged 54, possessed a heart of gold. Her kindness left a lasting impression on all those fortunate enough to have crossed paths with her. Mary was chair of the Tavistock fundraising branch of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, the largest charity that saves lives at sea around the coasts of the United Kingdom, the Republic of Ireland, the Channel Islands, and the Isle of Man. Aside from her role as chairwoman, Mary continued to act as joint souvenir secretary with her husband, Roy Redstill. Mary and Roy were keen members of Sea Search, an organisation that trains volunteer divers to map seabed types and marine life. She and Roy travelled all the way from their house on the south coast to do sea search in Loch Long, as well as more dramatic trips to Loch Sunat and Isle of Lismore. The couple had always enjoyed diving, especially together, and had become experienced divers, training in decompression techniques in 2005. The pair had made more than 1,350 dives over many years, but always using compressed air. On November the 8th, 2014, they gathered with their dear friend and fellow diver, Claire Boxall, to meticulously plan their upcoming deep dive, scheduled for November the 15th, at the Endac. Mary and Roy had used the centre previously and knew the layout quite well. The dive was scheduled to take 44 minutes. The plan was to descend to 60 metres, spend 15 metres at that depth, and then start their decompression steps to return to the surface. For the dive, Mary and Roy decided to use Trimix, a mixture of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen. It was the first time they had used Trimix. As stated earlier, they had only ever used compressed air on their dives. Mary appeared perfectly fine on the surface as they conducted their equipment checks. They descended smoothly together to a depth of 60 metres without any issues. However, as they began swimming back toward the pontoon to start their decompression, a change in her behaviour became apparent. Mary seemed unsure and unfocused and was making ineffective movements. She began to sink, and Roy tried to manage her buoyancy as well as his own. There was no understanding in her eyes, and although there was some water in her mask, she made no attempt to clear it. Suddenly, Mary dropped below 60 metres, and Roy saw a rush of air from her mouthpiece. She signalled that she could not breathe. With very few options, Roy decided to take the risk of decompression sickness and the bends by swiftly ascending to the surface with Mary. Once at the surface, the staff did their very best to help Mary, but she died at the scene, and Roy was airlifted to a decompression unit following the incident as he suffered from the bends. 1 month after the incident, Roy started a fundraiser for the DDRC, where he continued to receive excellent care following the accident. Thankfully, he was able to recover fully. Expert witness Thomas Anthony, who provides technical support to Navy divers, was asked by the coroner to check all the equipment Mary had used. He said that the specific Trimix gas they were using was not ideal for a 60-metre dive. Thomas also stated that it seemed as though she still had plenty of gas at the time of the incident, but 2 regulators in her equipment were not performing correctly and did not appear to have been serviced recently. This meant she would have to make a lot more respiratory effort to get the amount of gas she needed. Also, Trimix itself is dense and more difficult to breathe at that depth, which would have added to her problems. A third factor that affected Mary is the high nitrogen content in the gas mix, which posed narcotic, and because she had to work hard to breathe, there would also have been a buildup of carbon dioxide in her blood. Senior Coroner Katie Scarrett said the cause of death was a gas embolism and a lung-related pulmonary barotrauma and a pulmonary tumour. Katie reiterated that Mary had been in good health before the dive, but had died from a buildup of gas in her blood due to her substandard diving equipment. Following Mary's death, the waters of Dayhouse Quarry remained eerily tranquil until tragedy struck once more, 3 years later, on October the 8th, 2017. Vigimus Uras, a 28-year-old truck driver from Upminster in Essex, had a deep passion for diving. Those who knew him often described him as an enthusiastic diver who would drive during the night and dive during the day. Diving was not just a hobby for him, it was his life. Under the guidance of dive instructor Alexander Fox, Vigimas had recently achieved his Tech 40 certification, allowing him to dive up to 40 meters. Eager to put his newfound skills to the test, he had a trip to the NDAC in the works. On October the 8th, 2017, Vigimas arrived at the quarry for a morning group dive. Following the initial dive, he made an announcement in the afternoon that he planned to undertake a solo dive and borrowed a 7-litre cylinder for this purpose. He descended once more into the water at 3:10 p.m. Vigimas' dive computer indicated that he had reached a depth of 71 meters, which exceeded his level of competence. Diving solo at that depth was not permitted with his level of training, and this decision posed significant risks. He was also overweighted and had dived with his equipment set at extreme levels. 20 minutes into his dive, at about 3:30 p.m., as analysed by his dive computers, Vigimas shot uncontrollably to the surface, causing an air embolism to form in his lungs, and eventually biometric trauma as his chest ruptured. Vigimas ascended in minutes when he should have taken more than an hour. Thus, he missed 1 hour of decompression by coming up so fast without giving the nitrogen a chance to dissolve completely from his blood. The reason for his uncontrolled ascent was not entirely clear, but according to the coroner's report, it was likely caused by how his equipment was set up. Vigimas was found face down and unresponsive at the surface 20 minutes after his departure. Firefighter Paul Hargreaves, who had just completed a dive, had used an NDAC defibrillator as well as carrying out CPR for 20 minutes in a bid to resuscitate Vigimas before paramedics had taken over. The paramedics observed severe chest injuries to Vigimas and did everything in their power to save him. Unfortunately, it was not enough, and Vigimas passed away on scene. An inquest opened on the 13th of October, 5 days after Vigimas' death, and adjourned until March. Similarly to Mary's case, Coroner Katie Skerritt reviewed Vigimas' case. She stated that he was a qualified diver, but he had exceeded the limits of his certification. She concluded by saying it was a tragic accident involving a 28-year-old man doing what he enjoyed doing when he made a fatal error. It did not take long for the NDAC to make headlines again. Merely 5 months later, on March the 26th, 2018, Lance Corporal George Partridge failed to surface from its waters during the final week of his Army diver course. 27-year-old Lance Corporal George dedicated 8 years of his life to serving with 26 Engineer Regiment, based in Burnham Down, Wiltshire. His commitment included a tour of duty in Afghanistan in 2012. George was not only a soldier, but also a loving husband, eagerly anticipating the arrival of his first child. His dedication and service was soon to be recognised with a well-deserved promotion to the rank of corporal. On Monday the 26th of March, 2018, George was into the last week of a 5-week Army Advanced Diving 2 course at the NDAC, along with 11 other trainee divers. The students had been expecting to carry out their scheduled 19th dive to a depth of 21 to 23 meters. But in a decision that would be questioned by the jury, it was decided to skip this and proceed straight to dive 20, descending to the deeper of 2 Wessex helicopters at 26 to 27 meters. The divers were told to take a heavy 53-meter distance line down and run it between the shot line and wreck. Equipped with primary and backup air cylinders, and equipped with a full face mask with radio communication system, George descended on a line with dive buddy Stephen Hart at 11 a.m. Their task was expected to take no more than 10 minutes. The comm system was so unreliable that rope signals were normally used. Notably, the comms had not worked for George and Stephen during the dive, either between themselves or with their service attendants. Therefore, George and Stephen were generally relying on signals by tugs on their lifeline. The distance line George and Stephen were carrying had become entangled on their descent, but, unable to hear each other on the comm system, they had used hand signals to arrange that Stephen would hold the line and feed it to George as he swam towards the helicopter. The line was discovered to be 3 times longer than it should have been, introducing an unnecessary risk of entanglement. Visibility was about 10 meters, and it just went black after that. As Stephen was paying out the rope, he lost sight of George when he got to the 2 large rocks en route to the helicopter. Stephen then got a signal to come back. Once George reached the helicopter, he sent the rope signals to the surface, found, started, and finished work. But nothing after that. Soldier Thomas Moore, who acted as communications officer for the dive that day, said he received a lifeline signal from George saying, "You are holding me too tight on the lifeline. Give me some slack." A couple of minutes later, he again asked for more slack on the line. Thomas then tried to relay to George on the comms to come back up, but he got no response. After Stephen surfaced, Sergeant Dolly had been concerned to see a continuous stream of bubbles, suggesting a free flow before they had stopped. When the bubbles stopped, they really started to worry. Standby diver Corporal Michael Watson was dispatched to see what had happened to George. He had found him laying on his back at a depth of about 24 meters. His mask, still attached to the hose, was hanging off his face. Michael brought George to the surface in less than a minute, 17 minutes after the start of the dive. Calls had already gone out to the emergency services and for on-site assistance. Tragically, George's life could not be saved. Both of George's cylinders were found to be empty. The trainees had been warned to check the switch blocks that regulated airflow from their cylinders into their masks every few minutes, because a knock could cause both cylinders to start flowing at once, with the diver unaware that this was happening. This leaves a diver with less air to get back to the surface. They were also told to check their air gauges every 10 minutes, an interval the jury considered too long. In the drill before the dive, in which George had played the casualty with Stephen his rescuer, Sergeant Dolly recalled that George's switch block had been checked and found to be closed. The inquest was told by medical experts that George's cause of death was sudden death in adult. A post-mortem examination had revealed that George had previously undiagnosed minor anomaly in his right coronary artery, and sudden cardiac death syndrome had originally been given as cause of death. While George had been rated by instructors as top student in his group, there had also been doubts about his endurance. 5 separate medical episodes had occurred during various endurance exercises, but these had not been flagged up as forming a significant pattern. The jury found that the cardiac event which ended George's life was due to depletion of air during the dive, either directly or because of exertion and shock resulting from the lack of air. The jury highlighted multiple additional failings amongst the dive, which includes the change in the dive program made without permission, and the fact that neither Sergeant Dolly nor the trainees had been taught how to carry out the air endurance calculations that would have indicated how much faster air would run out on a deep, task-loaded dive. The use of such tables was introduced to Army diver training soon after George's death. Concerned about the radio communications breakdown, the jury also wanted to know why the Digicom 1 system, introduced for Army divers in 2002 and intended for use for up to 15 years, had still been in use at the time of the fatality. Navy Diving Life Support Manager Ian Taylor said that this was because it remained market leader and was basically the best out there. The dive supervisor, Staff Sergeant Justin Dolly, was questioned about the reason behind the decision not to go ahead with the planned dive, and he initially said it was felt that the dive could be missed because the previous week the trainees had done 2 deeper dives, including one to 30 meters in the Solent. But he also agreed with the Assistant Gloucestershire Coroner, Roland Wooderson, who suggested that the reason for the change was to do something more interesting and reach the helicopter. delivering a detailed, narrative verdict rather than the standard brief summary. Assistant Coroner Roland Wooderson pointed to significant points of failure, both in the Army diving course the soldier was undertaking and in the training of his dive supervisor. A subsequent Royal Navy Service Inquiry panel had published a comprehensive report stating that George had been using faulty diving equipment. Criticising the Army course, that report had made 53 recommendations on remedial action. The loss of George was felt hard by his squadron, the regiment and the corps, as well as everyone in the wider army who had the privilege of working with him. Tragically, just 7 months after George's passing, the Quarry would claim its 6th life. On the late morning of October the 6th, 2018, Arta and Kamila Sokolowska, both experienced divers residing in Reading and originally from Poland, arrived at the site with a friend. The trio prepared to carry out a dive to 60 meters. Kamila, aged 40, hadn't ventured to such depths before, but with Arta being a certified PADI open water instructor, she found the confidence she needed to take the dive on. Before their descent, they diligently checked their equipment at the surface, ensuring everything was in proper working condition. Kamila was diving on a single rented 12-litre air cylinder, whilst Arthur and the friend of the couple were on twin sets. On their descent, Kamila had signalled that she had a problem with her buoyancy control device inflator, but had then indicated that she wished to continue. Arta then continued down ahead of her. After their bottom time, the group planned to ascend. During their ascent, Arta noticed that Kamila was not pulling herself up on the line and found that she was struggling, with her mask filling up. Witnessing his wife struggling, at a depth of 35 meters, Arta decided to risk making a rapid ascent to get Kamila back to the surface, but she lost consciousness and had a heart attack on the way up. At the surface, assistance came quickly in response to Arta's calls, and a now distressed and emotional Arta shouted, "I killed my wife." A diver also using the site was on the pontoon kitting up when Arta first popped up, shortly followed by Kamila. The diver entered the water and towed Kamila to the pontoon, dekitted and helped pass her up. Camilla's kit was very negatively buoyant when the diver removed it, and there didn't seem to be any gas left to inflate. The diver's buddy quickly arrived and started working on her, giving her CPR and AED treatment, and within 15 minutes, there was a fast response vehicle, 3 ambulances and an air ambulance on scene. But it wasn't enough, unfortunately. Similarly to the previous deaths at the NDAC, an inquest was held regarding Camilla's case. The findings of the inquest raised several crucial points. Firstly, Camilla's experience level, or the potential lack thereof, was called into question based on the known elements of the dive. Diving air below 40 meters, especially for someone without prior experience at these depths, appeared to be an inexplicable choice. Given that it was an inland quarry, the water at such depths was likely extremely cold. Secondly, the tank volume of 12 litres in a single tank configuration was insufficient for the dive. Even with a reasonable surface air consumption rate of 15 litres per minute, her manometer would have dropped 9 bars per minute. Thirdly, the use of standard air, with its gas density of 9 grams per litre at depth, combined with the potential for nitrogen narcosis, contributed to the challenges faced during the dive. Fourthly, her equipment malfunction, specifically regarding the proper functioning of the buoyancy control device. As stated prior, her buoyancy control device power inflator was found to be restricted and slow to inflate. As a result of this, Kamila had to find and pull herself up the rope, increasing her workload immensely. Home Office pathologist Dr. Stephen Ledbetter said that the cause of death suggested that it could have been either the heart attack or cerebral gas embolism, or a combination of the two. In conjunction with the coroner's comments, it was inferred that a combination of factors, including negative buoyancy, increased work of breathing, her anxiety and relative inexperience, and possibly exposure to thermal stress may have collectively contributed and led Camilla to stop breathing during the ascent. Approximately 6 months following Camilla's tragic accident, the NDAC experienced another heartbreaking incident, marking the final tragedy before its closure. Richard Sanders, aged 52, embodied the essence of an all-round good bloke. According to those who knew him, he was the type of person who was always willing to lend a helping hand and support those around him. Richard had a passion for diving that had grown immensely in recent years, and he had truly become a proficient diver, having completed over 200 dives to a maximum depth of 40 meters. His dedication to the sport was evident through his volunteer work as a training officer at his local British sub-aqua club, wanting to be involved with diving even when he wasn't in the water. Richard had an expedition to the Royal Navy's wartime deep water harbour at Scapa Flow scheduled for later in the year. He and a friend of his, named Steve Smith, had planned to dive the wrecks of the German High Seas Fleet off the Orkney Islands at depths of 40 meters. They had hoped to be part of an expedition to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the scuttling of the ships. Determined to make the most of the trip, he decided to enroll in the TDI Trimix diver course at the NDAC to be able to safely react to any problems that he might encounter during the dives. The course was scheduled to run from the 10th to the 13th of November of that year. It was designed to show divers how to minimize the effects of narcosis by adding helium to offset the nitrogen in their breathing gas. While taking the course, Richard's TDI instructor, Mark Carwick, planned to teach him how to plan and execute dives, utilizing as little as 18% oxygen and diving to a maximum depth of 60 meters, with a blend of helium appropriate for the planned depth. On the first dive of the course, Richard's excitement and nerves seemed to get the better of him. As he descended into the depths of the water, Mark noticed that he was all over the place. Richard's head was down, and it was clear that he was struggling to maintain control and composure underwater. Recognizing the importance of safety, Mark made the difficult but necessary decision to terminate the dive prematurely. As they surfaced, Richard couldn't help but feel disappointed in himself. Later that afternoon, a second dive presented Richard with an opportunity for redemption. Determined to overcome his earlier challenges, he had regained his confidence and looked comfortable in what he was doing. A second student joined the team on day 2, and he and Richard completed a full skills circuit, which included taking off their masks and simulating a decompression ascent. Their second dive commenced later in the day at 3:59 p.m, and it was expected to last for 28 minutes. Richard had been designated as the dive leader. 20 minutes into the dive, and at a depth of 45 meters, Mark couldn't help but notice that Richard began to glance at his gauges, even though it wasn't necessary at that stage of the dive. This observation raised a subtle concern. Mark decided to bring the dive to a premature end and gave the appropriate signal. Richard turned to the other student, who had already deployed his marker buoy and deployed his own marker buoy with textbook efficiency. Richard then had to disconnect a hose to fill the surface marker buoy, but he didn't reconnect the hose. Mark moved in closer because he wanted Richard to reconnect the hose before they began their ascent. It was at this point Richard gave Mark a signal that he was out of air, but Mark could see on his gauges that he did have air as his cylinder was still approximately half full. Mark gave him his spare long hose regulator, which caused lots of bubbles, and he soon realized that they were in desperate trouble. This is when Richard removed his regulator and bolted to the surface, taking Mark with him. The alarms on Mark's wrist was telling him they were ascending too fast. Richard was doing his best to rise to the surface, while Mark grabbed his belt to try to slow him down. It was a fight for survival. Richard was trying to pull Mark up, and Mark was trying to pull Richard down. At 23 meters, Richard bolted again. Mark was terrified as the lines became entangled. It is at this point that Richard became unconscious. The other dive student said he saw something going on between Richard and Mark, but they then disappeared from view. Mark changed his wrist computer to allow him to resurface in the quickest time possible. He was on the surface at 4:37 p.m. and swam with Richard some distance to the nearby pontoon. It would have been a physically demanding distance to swim with a full kit on. Nobody was on the pontoon to raise the alarm. Therefore, Mark clipped Richard to a ladder before raising the alarm at 4:40 p.m. When the alarm was raised, 2 people from the offices attended with a defibrillator and oxygen, having already called the emergency services at 4:46 p.m. They proceeded with chest compressions until the ambulance paramedics arrived at 4:56 p.m. Unfortunately, Richard was declared dead at 5:18 p.m. An inquest into his death was opened and adjourned to September the 19th by the Gloucestershire coroner. The medical cause of death was determined to be 1A immersion pulmonary edema, which led to asphyxiation. A medical expert told the inquest that a diver suffering from this condition will become breathless and think there was a problem with their gas supply and check their gauges, following by coughing and disorientation. The symptoms get worse as they become vertical and start ascending. There is no screening test that can definitively determine whether an individual will suffer from IPO, but there are a number of known factors which increase the likelihood of an individual being subject to IPO. A medical questionnaire given to Richard was completed before diving. Had he answered yes to any of the specific set of questions, he would not have been able to dive. However, this inquest heard that Richard answered no to a number of questions when, more accurately, some of these answers should have been yes. When asked if there was a history of drug or alcohol abuse, a history of blackouts or fainting, or if he suffered from back problems, he said no. But if he had said yes, further medical assessment would have been required and the dive would not have gone ahead. An inquest heard that Richard had been unconscious for 8 minutes underwater, 3 minutes while being towed to the pontoon, and a further 6 minutes before CPR could be commenced. Medical experts concluded that if there had been surface cover on the pontoon, these timings would have been reduced by 3 minutes. But in all likelihood, this would not have had any effect on the unsuccessful outcome over the resuscitation of Richard. Following Richard's death, the NDAC continued to be open to the public for about 3 more years. On the 18th of February, 2022, the NDAC issued a statement via social media saying that the site was permanently closed. The following month, it was reported that the site had been purchased by a company seeking to develop equipment to enable people to live deep underwater. And so, after almost 2 decades in operation, what remains of the NDAC are the memories of all those who had a chance to experience its wonders. May Hank Austin, Janine Davidson, Mary Redsill, Wojciech Uras, George Partridge, Kamila Sokolowska, and Richard Sanders rest in peace. This has been Gripping Horror. I hope to see you in the next one.